In Russia, President Vladimir Putin has weighed in on Wednesday's supermarket bombing that injured 13 people in his hometown of St. Petersburg. Putin called it a terrorist attack and revealed his tough approach towards such attacks.
When there is a threat to lives and health of our officers, they should act firm and take no prisoners to kill bandits on the spot.
Well, at first, police didn't say it was a terrorist attack, but then, as we saw, Putin said it was a terrorist attack. And Russian authorities are saying the bomb was packed with shrapnel to cause as much harm as possible. Now, ISIS may be trying to maintain its global impact with continued terrorist attacks, but according to the U.S.-led coalition fighting the terrorist group, less than 1,000 ISIS fighters remain in their home base, which is the desert between western Iraq and eastern Syria.
Iraq and Syria have both declared victory over Islamic State in recent months after a year that saw the two countries' armies and a range of allies drive Islamic State fighters out of their self-proclaimed caliphate. All right, i24News Middle East correspondent Michael Pluchak has more.
Fewer than 1,000 Islamic State fighters remaining in Iraq and eastern Syria. That's just a third of the estimated figure only 3 weeks ago. But the figure from the United States-led coalition excludes areas in western Syria under the control of President Bashar al-Assad and his allies. And it doesn't mean the war against the jihadists is over.
ISIS retains the capability to launch successful surprise offensives and retake territories from Assad forces.
One point of rare agreement between the West and Russia, Assad's main ally.
It cannot be ruled out that IS groups may still appear on the liberated territory. But for now, the Russian contingent will focus on providing assistance and building peace.
The peace-building front, however, has been far less effective. UN-backed Geneva talks failed 8 consecutive times, even after a Saudi intervention instilled a new, softer-speaking head of opposition. And Russia's attempts have been only slightly more successful. Cooperating with Iran and Turkey, they managed to create 4 de-escalation zones, although those haven't always been exactly de-escalated. And now, Russian-led peace talks are facing a fresh set of challenges. On Tuesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin invited Syrian Kurdish leaders to talk in Sochi at the end of January. That was a deal-breaker for Turkey, who had already once sabotaged peace talks in November, because Russia integrated Syria's Kurds into the talks. This time, the Russian announcement prompted this.
It's certainly not possible to continue with Assad. How can we embrace a future with a Syrian leader who has killed close to 1 million of his citizens?
Basically regressing the Turkish position as of late that Assad could stay. Now, Turkey might be returning to its original stance on the Syrian war, one diametrically opposed to that of Russia and Iran, that Assad must actually go. But Assad seems confident he's not going anywhere. This week, increasing air raids on rebel-held areas in the north of Syria. He also cut a deal with one of the last rebel-held areas around Damascus, eastern Ghouta, which has been under a crippling siege since 2013. Civilians in need of urgent medical care were allowed to be evacuated in exchange for government workers being held prisoner by the rebels. But many more remain besieged in the Damascus suburb, and winter is making it far worse. Michael Pluchak, i24News.
Let's bring in John Sitilides, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. And John, we have Russia taking credit for the defeat of Islamic State in Syria. We have Iraq taking credit, along with Iran also taking credit for the defeat of ISIS in Iraq. And then, of course, the Trump administration taking credit for the defeat of ISIS all over the place. Does it really matter?
To a certain degree, it does. I mean, I think Russia deserves credit for pursuing its goal and achieving it of preserving the Assad regime in western Syria. But I really think that the bulk of the credit does go to the United States, our Syrian Kurdish allies, and the Iraqi armed forces that the U.S. has trained over the years in defeating Islamic State in northern Iraq. And there is going to be a problem there with Iran filling the vacuum there. To a certain degree, and I think the Trump administration needs to determine how to engage the allies that we have in the region to contain Iran, and also the possibility that Islamic State will metastasize in northern Africa, South Asia, and the Philippines.
Well, we have clearly just spoken before that they're already very active in Afghanistan, and I wonder what you think the Trump administration's policy is there in Afghanistan to combat ISIS.
That's going to be very interesting to see, because one thing that Trump has made very clear as a candidate and as president so far in his first year is that they have no intention of pursuing nation building in Afghanistan. I think it might be more of a series of attacks against the Taliban and related terrorist forces in Afghanistan, offshore platforms being used to conduct those types of operations, even as the U.S. military now is ramped up to about 7,000 to 9,000 for training purposes to help train the Afghans to defeat the Taliban. The one thing we cannot afford to see happen is a vacuum in governance in Afghanistan. That's the vacuum that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Islamic State will all be competing to try to fill.
If it does matter who gets credit for defeating Islamic State, and I don't disagree with you that the Kurds certainly get a lion's share of the credit, but in the end, I wonder if it doesn't matter, because look what we did when the Kurds were trying to seek their independence. They essentially got no help from the United States in terms of Iraq, and as a result, there's essentially no reward for them.
I don't think the Syrian Kurds or the Kurds in other countries are done seeking their independence, David. The Syrian Kurds right now have an upper hand in that they do control territory in northeastern Syria. The question will be, what will the U.S. do with their political demands? Are they tied to those of the Iraqi Kurds who maybe acted prematurely in seeking independence several months ago? And Russia, unfortunately, I think, from Rex Tillerson's op-ed in the New York Times, has been given an outsized role in helping to shape the future of Syria. And so I think Russia will play a major role in deciding to what extent the Kurds are able to achieve autonomy, and what will their new tactical allies, the Turks, do, as your correspondent mentioned earlier. So the Kurdish issue is highly convoluted, very tangled, but it's not done, not by a long shot.
All right, John Sitilides, geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors, thank you so much. And as we've said so many times, again and again, all of these conflicts with the Kurds, with Iran, they will bubble to the surface as ISIS gets defeated. And then what happens? Does the Trump administration cut and run, or do they stay for the long haul?
Or maybe there's something genius about the Trump administration not really being that tied down, because as John pointed out, it's a mess. These are all dangerous places, and to the extent that perhaps either the Russians or the Turks or the Iranians are overextended, maybe that's on them, and the United States can focus on elsewhere. I mean, it's a risk, but it's also an interesting way to look at it.
True, but do we want Russia and Iran to shape the Middle East for the next coming generation?
That's the bigger challenge. The answer would be no, at least if you're looking at it from the United States.
That's a good answer. I like that answer. Thank you for agreeing with me. All right, still to come on Crossroads, Alabama officials push aside a last-minute legal challenge from Republican Roy Moore, officially naming Democrat Doug Jones as the winner of Alabama's Senate election.
But first, headlines from our headquarters in the Middle East in Tel Aviv, when Crossroads continues after this.